Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Trafficking in persons in the domestic work sector remains prevalent, particularly affecting women. Despite gendered and deeply gendered and racialized assumptions about the nature of domestic work as not work, and a lack of political will to take effective action to ensure the application and enforcement of labour laws contribute to impunity, creating a protection gap within which rights violations persist and access to justice is denied. Historical legacies of slavery and the slave trade, the intersections of gender, race and ethnicity continue to shape the working conditions of domestic workers and the resulting risks of trafficking in persons. My mandate has received and continues to receive numerous concerns in relation to migrant domestic workers and allegations of trafficking in persons. Their cases all share common features. The victims are primarily women from disadvantaged communities and are offered promising jobs by unscrupulous recruiters in their countries of origin or residence. They are offered visas, flights and monthly salaries. Upon arrival, the conditions of employment differ significantly from those outlined in the labour contracts offered to the women, and at their employers' households, they are subjected to physical violence and labour abuses. Often the women are unable to leave and terminate their contracts as they may be subject to penalties for breach of contract or punished for and penalised for absconding. Some, many, indeed, are also subjected to sexual harassment and sexual violence, including rape by their employers and members of their employers' families. The specific nature of domestic work and weak regulatory responses by states produce a structural vulnerability to exploitation. Isolation and dependence on employers foster a breeding ground for all kinds of exploitation. Such risks and vulnerabilities are increased for migrant domestic workers who are non-documented or in an irregular situation, and who fear being at risk of deportation if they contact state authorities to seek assistance and protection. Tied visa regimes can also contribute to increased risks of trafficking, but despite persistent credible evidence of the impact of such restrictions, states continue to operate tied visas and sponsorship schemes, both de jure and de facto. Distinguished delegates, the lack of access to safe, regular migration contributes to high risks of trafficking, creating and producing vulnerabilities to exploitation. It is essential to ensure that labour migration pathways are rights-based and regular and effectively implemented. As of May 2024, among 82 countries that completed a migration governance indicators assessment, only 23% had a migration strategy addressing the different needs of migrant women. The adoption of bilateral labour migration agreements can strengthen and protect workers' rights when these are grounded in international human rights and labour law, and are accompanied by sufficient resources to effectively monitor recruitment processes and ensure accountability when human rights and labour standards are abused. Against a background of reliance on migrant worker remittances in many countries, there is a lack of political will to highlight patterns of exploitation in countries of destination. I urge all governments to revise their bilateral agreements to ensure that they are gender responsive and non-discriminatory, and that they protect the human rights of migrant workers effectively. Discrimination, gender inequality and gendered stereotypes contribute to failures to identify victims of trafficking or to provide assistance. Labour inspections can play a critical role in preventing trafficking and in identifying victims. But the role of labour inspectorates is undermined by the exclusion of domestic work from their competences and functions in many countries. States must ensure that labour inspectorates have the authority to conduct proactive, independent and regular inspections of private recruitment agencies and private households. Women victims of trafficking returning home also face the risks of stigmatisation, discrimination and poverty, and are at risk of being trafficked again, especially when left without assistance upon return and without long-term inclusion measures. Legal assistance and information, including on compensation, are often not available or difficult to access in practice. the absence of state compensation funds and limited international cooperation leaves many victims of trafficking without remedies. Excellencies, victims and survivors of human trafficking must never be criminalised, but must be supported through child-sensitive and gender-responsive approaches, recognising the non-punishment principle. There is an urgent need to implement and strengthen gender-sensitive and trauma-informed investigations, as well as international cooperation to ensure accountability for trafficking in persons in the context of migration and domestic work, including where trafficking occurs through the use of AI and digital technologies. Cooperation with migrant domestic workers associations and trade unions and an enabling environment for civil society is key to ensuring prompt identification of victims and provision of early unconditional assistance. Migrant domestic workers must have access to decent work and safe, regular migration pathways. I urge states that have not done so to ratify and implement the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families and the ILO Domestic Workers Convention. Mr. Vice President, I turn now to the report on my visit to Guinea-Bissau. I would like to thank the Government of Guinea-Bissau for the excellent cooperation shown to my mandate before, during and after the visit. I commend the cooperative approach of all authorities and the willingness to engage in an open and constructive dialogue. I am concerned, however, at the prevalence of child trafficking and the lack of effective investigations and accountability for this serious crime and serious human rights violation. The limited capacity of state institutions, law enforcement, and lack of independence of the judiciary, corruption in the administration of justice, combined with weak child protection systems and extreme poverty, contribute to particularly high risks facing children. I urge Guinea-Bissau to implement gender-responsive child rights and trauma-informed criminal justice procedures to strengthen access to justice, particularly in rural areas, ensuring the rights, safety and dignity of victims, and effective measures to combat impunity for child trafficking, including by religious leaders. Limited capacity for protection of the rights of workers, high concentration of workers in the informal sector increases risks of trafficking for forced labour, particularly in high-risk sectors such as domestic work, agriculture, fisheries and mining. Normalisation of exploitative practices in affected sectors also hampers identification of trafficking victims and intersects with discrimination based on gender, migration status and socio-economic status. The continuing political instability hinders the strengthening of institutions and the administration of justice. Serious concerns in relation to corruption in law enforcement and in the judiciary and lack of independence of the judiciary must be addressed. Comprehensive assistance and protection measures for victims must be implemented in cooperation with civil society. I would like to turn now to my report on the country visit to Liberia, conducted in December 2024. I thank the government for their excellent cooperation and for facilitating the visit, during which I visited rural and border areas and observed the government's efforts to combat trafficking in persons. Liberia has made commendable strides in establishing a national anti-trafficking task force and in legislative reform. I also welcome the launch of Liberia's first National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, alongside other dedicated plans on trafficking, child labour and inclusion of persons with disabilities. Despite these advances, significant challenges remain. Assistance for victims of domestic servitude, forced labour and sexual exploitation is limited, especially in remote areas. Government-run safe homes, hotlines and emergency shelters were not fully operational at the time of the visit, and services are lacking due to limited staffing, resources and capacity, all of which increase the risk of trafficking and re-trafficking of victims. The capacity of the Independent National Commission on Human Rights, border agents and labour commissions to identify and refer cases must be strengthened. Specialised training and resource allocation are also needed for police, judiciary and social workers, in particular child protection workers, especially those in hard-to-reach areas and along borders. Moreover, sanctions must be effective and proportionate, and effective action must be taken prioritising prevention of and accountability for trafficking in high-risk sectors such as agriculture, mining, fisheries and domestic work. I am particularly concerned at the prevalence of child trafficking for sexual exploitation, particularly girls in concession areas, in border areas and urban centres. Child trafficking particularly affects girls in situations of extreme poverty and out of school. I am alarmed at the apparent tolerance of child trafficking for sexual exploitation. I urge the government to prioritise action to combat child trafficking and prioritise allocation of resources for anti-trafficking action to address internal and cross-border trafficking, ensuring that children and migrant victims are effectively protected. Finally, just to note that I am grateful to the governments of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chad and Mongolia for acceptance of my country visit requests, and I look forward to continuing cooperation. Thank you.